friends. I suppose one of the reasons why Cain turned out badly was because there had been no books on child psychology written in his time. Those who have read many psychologies, I suppose, have become convinced, as most of us have, that during the last 10 or 20 years they've been written for abnormal people. How would you like to hear a little psychology for normal people like yourselves? There are 10,000 people that are running toward an abyss, and one man runs from it. He seems to the others to be in flight. And when indeed there are so many abnormalities, it behooves us to recall that there is really a psychology for normal people. And we will try to explain it tonight in this lecture, first of all, by showing the difference between knowing and loving, and then showing the difference in knowing and loving between man and woman. First of all, our soul has two faculties. One faculty is the faculty of knowing. The other is the faculty of loving. We are like an animal inasmuch as we have sensations and passions, but this is something which is specifically human. Knowing belongs to man's intellect or reason. Loving belongs to our will. The object of the intellect is truth. The object of the will is goodness or love. Now, they both operate in quite a different fashion. This is how our intellect operates. Whenever our intellect knows anything, it always brings it down to the level of our intellect. Suppose, for example, a teacher, there must be many teachers listening, they often have the experience of explaining some abstract principle to children. They always have to do that in concrete terms. If the child is to know and understand, the principle must be brought down to the level of the child's intellect. That is why sometimes when we want to memorize something, we make an association in our intellect. It's something that we know. I remember once I was to meet a man with the name of Lummick, and someone in my office said, "Now, try to remember that name, because I'm very poor at remembering names." And the secretary said, "Now, just remember that his name rhymes with stomach." Do you know what I called him? Kelly. You take something very simple that is known. Take a flower in a crannied wall. Well, you bring that up into an intellect like Tennyson's, and it comes out as a poem. A flower in the crannied wall, if I knew what you are, root and all, I should know what God and man is. So the object of the intellect is in itself. Now notice the difference with the will. The will always goes out to meet the object that it loves. If, for example, you love music, you have to meet the demands of music. If you study a foreign language, you have to go out to meet the demands of that language. If, for example, a young man is courting a woman and she loves poetry, well, he's very foolish if he tries to quote mathematics to her. Now, there is a profound difference between knowing and loving from this point of view also. My little angel is cleaning the backboard. I had a little conference with him beforehand. He said that he was going to do everything very, very quick tonight because I was talking about spiritual faculties. Here is another law of the intellect or reason. Whenever the mind knows anything that is below it, it elevates that thing by knowing it. Whenever it knows anything that is above it in dignity, it to some extent degrades it. Now let us take, for example, the knowledge of a scientist. A scientist gives us physics, biology, or our mind, as we know the birds and the flowers and the trees, draws all of these things into itself, and the mind gives them a new kind of existence, a new kind of being. We spiritualize the whole lower universe. That was the reason that wise old Aristotle said that the mind of man is a microcosmos, a little universe containing the whole world within itself. And as it knows things that are below it, it ennobles them. That is the basis of the Jewish hymns of praise. For example, the Psalms of David and the Benedicite, the three youths in the fiery furnace. God is praised for the clouds, the sky, the oceans, the mountains, and everything in the universe. This is incidentally the nobility of human knowledge. The fact that it spiritualizes everything that is below the mind. Now, when you come to something that is above the mind in dignity, oh, then it's degraded because we have to pull it down to our level. For example, you are listening. What does my angel look like? It's hard to picture an angel. My angel has a 21-inch wing spread. You try to bring the knowledge of God down to your intellect. It's almost impossible. That is why we have to, in the natural order, negate many things about earth in order to know God. Incidentally, that was one of the fine insights of the play, was it not, Green Pastures, where God appeared as just a common figure on the stage. No attempt to approximate deity. It's always good theater, therefore, in a movie, for example, not to show the person of Christ, because one would miss his divinity by making him purely human. Now, we come to the will. And here, the operation is just the contrary, because we said the will always draws everything to itself. When the will loves anything that is below it, it degrades itself. Take, for example, suppose the primary love of man was money. Man would become like gold, cold and hard and yellow. Suppose it's carnality, just living for the pleasures of the flesh alone. Man degrades himself because we always become like that which we love. A man loves alcohol, he becomes an alcoholic. Degrades himself, pulls himself down by loving that which is beneath him. If a man loves something that is above him, then he becomes a noble. That is why it is important for youth, and for everyone, in fact, to have the right kind of ideals and the right kind of heroes, because we tend to imitate them. Whom do we love? A player of a percussion instrument? Is he an ideal? A moaner? A soldier? A patriot? A saint? You can readily see, the higher the love, the more human dignity is lifted up. That is why, to a great extent, the level of any civilization is the level of its womanhood. Because when a man loves a woman, he has to be worthy of her. The higher she is in virtue, in nobility of character, truth and justice and goodness, the more a man has to aspire to be worthy of her. History of civilizations could actually be written in terms of the level of womanhood. Now, this is the difference between knowing and loving, and this helps answer a riddle, or not a riddle, but a question sometimes people ask. Why is it that very learned people are not religious? Now, that question must not point to the fact that people who are religious are not intellectual. But we must remember that the intellect and the will operate in different ways. The intellect draws something to itself, and the will always goes out to that which it loves. Now, take, for example, a chief of police. Does a chief of police know anything about robbery? He certainly has a fine knowledge of robbery. He knows how to get into banks. He knows how to break into houses. Probably the chief of police has most of the burglar's tools. But does he ever rob? No, he does not love robbery. See, there's no intrinsic connection between the two. Take, for example, the train announcer. Does a train announcer know where the train goes? Yes. Does he ever go there? No. And so it's possible, as you see, for people to know something about any particular science or art and still not love. Thomas Aquinas said, the least love of God is worth more than the knowledge of all created things. This has been a very abstract lesson so far, and I hope now that we can make it a little concrete. And it will be a little more concrete if we tell you that now we're going to be concerned with the difference between a man and a woman in knowing and in loving. I hope that I start no disputes in families this evening. The first difference between a man and a woman is that a man is concerned principally with things and a woman with persons. That's the first difference. Hence, a man is much more interested in business than a woman. A man's interest is much more remote. A woman's interest is more immediate. A man's interest is the abstract. A woman's is more concrete and intimate. A man is concerned with ends and goals and purposes. A woman is more concerned with something that is very proximate and close and near and dear to her. And because a woman is more interested in persons, a woman is much more inclined to gossip. That is not necessarily a fault any more than talking about business. Ever notice, hear a conversation of men on a train? Almost always business. As for gossip, the woman doesn't need to believe everything she hears, but at least she believes she can repeat it. And it is this that causes sometimes misunderstandings. For example, a man will come home from the office full of business, and he will say, listen, dear, today I got an order for 250,000 nuts and bolts. We were the only factory that was able to supply those in Greater Manhattan. You know what his wife will say? Dear, how do you want your eggs? And then the other way around. Man is reading the newspaper. Woman comes in, the wife comes in and says, "Notice anything new?" Why is it, after thousands of years of civilization, husbands have never been able to pick out hairdos and new hats? Now, though there is this difference, understand they complement one another, and very beautifully. After all, this is the future, and this is the present, and both are needed to make a happy family. A second difference between the love of a man and the love of a woman is that a man will always give reasons for loving. A woman gives no reasons for loving. I must be right on this one. For example, a man will say, "Oh, you're beautiful, I love you because your teeth are pearly." And a woman just says, "I love you." Her heart is autonomous. Man's reason is always mixed up, his love is always mixed up with his reason. Men generally write the love songs. "That's why I love you. You're the cream in my coffee. You're the salt in my stew. You're my Bendel bonnet, you're my Shakespeare sonnet, you're my Mickey Mouse." They're not very good reasons for loving, but at least there they are. And I'll ask my angel not to erase that in order that we can follow the three reasons. A woman never tells you why she loves, she just tells you how. Take, for example, this beautiful poem of Elizabeth Barrett Browning. I'm sure you're familiar with it. How do I love thee? Let me count the ways. I love thee to the depth and breadth and height my soul can reach, and feeling out of sight for the ends of being an ideal grace. I love thee to the level of every day's most quiet need, by sun and candlelight. I love thee freely, as men strive for right. I love thee purely, as they turn from praise. I love thee with a passion put to use in my old griefs, and with my childhood's faith. I love thee with a love I seem to lose with my lost saints. I love thee with a breath, smiles, tears of all my life. And if God choose, I shall but love thee better after death. This also explains why, in a dispute between the two, a man will resort to logic and the woman will resort to tears. A third difference is that defects mar a man's love. Defects do not hurt a woman's love. A man hears somebody talk about a woman that he loves or that he's going to marry, and he'll say, "Well, after all, I've got to know that woman, and I better listen to this." But a woman won't listen. She knows the man has defects. She loves him anyway. Remember the popular song? "That's my Bill. He's a good-for-nothing blankety blank blank blank, but he's my Bill anyway." And I believe that there's something maybe divine in that kind of love because God loves us that way. Despite all of our defects and despite all of our failings. And coming then to a summary of knowledge and love. At the beginning, we never can love anybody or anything unless we know that person or know that thing. That is why there has to be, say, an introduction first, before there can be the beginning of love. But then after a time, love creates knowledge. How often that happens, for example, in an enduring marriage of a husband and wife. They know one another's moods and attitudes and fears and joys without ever a word being spoken. They've loved one another so deeply that they have created a new kind of knowledge. And so in order to know God, love God, we must first know Him. But then, once we know Him, we can begin to love Him. And that opens up an entirely new field of knowledge that in its greatest height, the mystic alone understands. And what is true of religion is true of something that is allied to it, namely patriotism. We need only to know just a little bit about this great country of ours in order to love it. And please God, under the inspiration of a little bit of faith and loyalty, we'll all begin to love it much more than we do. And then we'll know how truly great it is. Could it be that those of us who live in this modern world already have enough knowledge, but possibly not enough love? Our brains are big enough. It is our hearts that are too small. When we expand them in love, we will find peace. God love you. And that the difference is this: all of the other bishops had mothers who told them that they would all come out on top. I have more problems than they do. They don't have the problem of whether to part their hair in the middle. The subject of this telecast is how to think. First of all, how to think about statistics and figures and graphs. Secondly, how to think about new ideas. First of all, how to think about statistics. There are two kinds of reasoning, or two general ways of thinking. Now here we're getting very deep, but it will only last for a second. You can turn off to another program while I explain this, then come back. It'll be over briefly. One way of reasoning is called deduction, and that is from the universal to the particular. For example, all men are mortal, John is a man, therefore John is mortal. And the other reasoning, from which there come graphs and statistics, is induction. Induction is from the particular to the general or the universal. Now, one of the reasons why we have to use this particular kind of reason is because we would never know certain conclusions unless we made an investigation. That's one of the reasons we have to have statistics. For example, Suppose you wanted to answer such questions as these. Is marmalade stickier than jam? Well, you have to use induction and go around and stick your finger in marmalade and jam. Or this problem. Do babies with blue booties cry louder than babies with pink booties? Which do men prefer, nightshirts or pajamas? That's the question you would have to investigate. You never could find it out by deduction. Now these inductions can be complete when you investigate all of the cases and all of the samples, or they can be incomplete. There are very few that are actually complete. For example, a mother has 4 children. 3 of them are in the room. She says, "Where is Gwendolyn?" As soon as she gets the answer, she has complete induction. She's made an investigation of the location of all of her children. Now, incomplete induction means that you cannot investigate all cases. So you take some samples and investigate a few. From these, you get statistics, you get graphs. I want to tell you about a graph picture that I have hanging in my office, and I have it hanging there in order that I will never take graphs and statistics too seriously. I want you to take a look at it. The title of it is "The Fund for the Poor of the World." And the 12 months are at the top. And the line, the graph, is very, very low. In fact, the fund is low until you get to the month of June. And then in June it skyrockets and then comes down again very low the rest of the year. I am seated at a desk answering a telephone, and I'm saying to someone, looking at the graph, "Let's see now. Last year I was away in June." That's when everything went up. Suppose now we wanted to make some statistical finding about how many youths in America under 21 years of age said their prayers. How could we do it? Well, one method, we might telephone them and say, "Are you saying your prayers?" And then secondly, we might hide a camera in the bedroom and take a picture of them. And thirdly, we might also ask them to keep a diary and write down every time they said their prayers. Suppose now I gave you a statistic. Suppose I investigated the number that said their prayers, or I said that I did, and I gave you this answer. The 12.3% of the youths of America under 21 years of age say their prayers. Now, you'd be very much impressed with that, wouldn't you? Because there's that 3%. And you would say, "My, that must be scientific." That 12.3, that was one of the great advantages, incidentally, of the Ivory Soap advertisement. Ivory Soap, 99 and 44, 100% pure. And you would say to yourself, "My goodness, if Ivory Soap admitted that there's 56 100ths of 1% impurity, that must be good soap." It was the fraction that got you. All right, now suppose I said that, 12.3. Now I'm going to tell you how we might arrive at that conclusion. Suppose I investigated. Cannot investigate all of the youth in America. Suppose I phoned 600 of them, from which I got 12.3. Now I'm going to give you some rules for statistics. And notice how they're going to be worked out. Whenever you hear a statistic, always ask these questions. 1, how many possible cases are there? That is to say, how many cases could be tested? 2, how many were tested? 3, Can you believe what they told you? That was the problem Kinzig had. Did everybody tell Kinzig the truth? Not on your life. You can't be sure if you call up the boys and say, did you say your prayers? Did they said their prayers? And fourth, if it comes from an independent laboratory, who paid for the experiment? If cigarette X blows much better smoke rings than cigarette Y, who paid for that investigation? The independent laboratory isn't in business with their health, you know. Now, keeping this in mind, suppose we investigated 600. How many boys and girls are there in the United States under 21 years of age? 60,160,000. You think that's a pretty good test? How many are we getting? We're getting 6 out of every 601,600. Work that out in percentages. What percentage of the youth of the country are we testing? Now get this. I'm not finished yet. Of 1%. You see, I'm a rapid calculator. Did you ever hear about the rapid calculator? It was a man who was on a train. Somebody behind him said 648 cows as they passed by one field, 1,238 cows, 78 cows. The individual was curious. He said, how do you count them so fast with this train going this way? He said, I'm a rapid calculator. And he said, I count the legs, divide by 4. All right, if I investigated 600 cases out of the 60 million, I've only sampled 0.0000099% of the cases. How much is it worth? Nothing. Nothing from the point of view of reason. Remember, in 1936, the Literary Digest sampled 10 million people, and after sampling 10 million people as to how they would vote, they concluded that the electoral votes in November of that year would be 370 for Landon and 161 for Roosevelt. And they consulted 10 million. What do you suppose we're going to get if we consult 600 or 800? Did Landon become president? Anybody got an old Landon button just to remind us of these things? Another sample. Some years ago, Johns Hopkins University admitted women to the university. The following year, I was reading in a work on statistics, figure was given out that 33 1/3% of the women who attended Johns Hopkins University married professors. That was marvelous opportunity for young women going to a university. They would have a choice of all of these learned men. All right, what are the laws of figures? 1, how many cases were possible? 2, how many were investigated? So we asked, how many students were there at Johns Hopkins? Women. 3, how many married a professor? 1. So if you want to think clearly, always find out how many cases were possible before you believe a statistic. Now, here's one statistic that you can take from me that is absolutely reliable, and it's worth remembering. 50% of all of the married people in the United States are women. The other 50 are men. Now, another way to think is never completely follow a mood. See, there are styles in thinking just as there are styles in women's clothes. I once saw a man running like mad with a hat box in his hand. I said, "What are you running for?" He says, "I'm trying to get the hat home before it gets out of style." Well, there are fashions in thinking, too. And the fashions in thinking are made by scientists. For example, we've had three styles. We had biology, was a very popular science at one time, and then physics, and then psychology. In 1859, when Darwin published his Origin of Species, not scientists now, but popularizers, lyricizers, romanticizers, those who felt that art and literature and everything else should dance to the tune "Pipe for It" by a science, made everything evolve. For example, Grant Allen wrote about the evolution of God, evolution of marriage by Westermarck, creative evolution by Bergson, which the whole cosmos was evolving. I used to attend lectures at the University of Paris. Bergson was there teaching, and he was very popular, you see, because he had romanticized this. It was the mood and fashion to talk of evolution in those days. And you had to go sit through a dull, stale, flat, unprofitable lecture on mathematics in order to save your seat for Bergson's lecture. And all of the fashionable dames of Paris and London were there. You'd find outside of the Collège de France, you'd find automobiles, Rolls-Royce, Chanard Walkiers, Hispanis, Suiza, Renaults, and all the fine machines. I remember one day coming out of the class of Bergson, some English lady spoke to me. She says, "Wasn't that a wonderful lecture?" I said, "What did he say?" And so she told me something that he didn't say, and I spoke to her in French. She didn't understand a word of French, but Bergson was wonderful. So it was the fashion. Then that fashion died. Then when Einstein developed his theory of relativity, then we got a whole group of lyricizers here who said that everything is relative to space-time. And then we got relativity of morals, relativity of law. And then we got a new kind of literature in which we were constantly getting back to new beginnings. Remember Gertrude Stein, "A rose is a rose, is a rose, is a rose, is a rose." And Professor Alfred North Whitehead of Harvard said that God is a creature whose matrix is space-time. It was just a popular thing to do, to talk about space-time. And then that ceased to be popular, and then we got into the domain of psychology. And when Freud, as a scientist, published his work in which he developed the importance of the subconsciousness, which was indeed a great scientific contribution, there immediately cropped up here those who made everything dance to the tune of psychology. Then you got juvenile delinquency explained away as an Oedipus complex. God was called a father complex. Then you got a new style of literature. Notice today the short stories don't end, they just stop. There are no characters in literature like there were in the Victorian era, characters with an ethical simplicity like Micawber or Uriah Heep. They're disconnected, like pearls in the string the string of which is broken. And one is interested only today in the psychology of everything. That's because it happens to be a mood. Now the point is this: one cannot take, and to think well, remember that you cannot take the methods and the conclusions of one science and apply them indiscriminately to another science. Each science has its own object, its own method. And it is entitled to that method. But you cannot take it, cannot take biology and apply it to engineering. You cannot take the subject of a sentence and apply it to another sentence. For example, take for example the sentence, this sentence here. Mathilde is artistic. And now take the sentence, the piggy, Porky, is fat enough to kill. Now, can you take the predicate artistic and apply it to this sentence here and say Porgy is artistic? Can you take this, Porgy is fat enough to kill, and apply it to Mathilde? Well, neither can you take the conclusions of one science simply because there's evolution of the biological order doesn't follow that God is evolving, that marriage is evolving, that everything else is evolving. When, for example, you have hurt the palm of your hand, you do not call in a florist. If you break the key in your door, you do not call in a piano tuner. Something happens to your windpipe, you don't call in a plumber. If you want to discover the authenticity of a Rembrandt, you don't call in the Lord Chancellor. He's a specialist in law, but he's not necessarily a specialist in art. And therefore, every particular science has its own domain, its own method. And a good thinker will not allow the methods and the categories and the theories to overflow into other domains. And furthermore, it's always a good thing to remember that if you marry the mood or the spirit of an age, you will be a widow in the next one. These fashions simply do not last. And it is not to be said that if one does not follow each of these fashions, that one is behind the times. No, one is behind the scenes. And sees that theories that were popular years ago will be forgotten in 10 or 15 years. But we've got to have some principles that do not change to live by. Who today knows Herbert Spencer? How many books of Herbert Spencer are taken out of the public libraries of the United States? Yet everybody read Spencer 50 years ago. Nobody knows him today. That's going to be true of the same ones who create the mood of this hour. Therefore, to think well, one has to have principles that are independent of space and time, by which one can live. We know that these principles exist, and we know there's such a thing as truth, simply because there's a logos, there's an intelligence behind the universe. And one of the great thrills of thinking is to know all the sides, but also to know what is right and what is true. Why, it's a romance very much, as Chesterton says,